I'm Staff Sergeant Maya Torres, 29, and I worked my way up from a cramped Albuquerque apartment to leading soldiers with a clean record and hard-won trust. For years, I covered for my sister, sending money, smoothing messes, defending her when I shouldn't. But when a birthday gift she sent hit my desk and 10 minutes later our entire base went into lockdown, I drew a line that changed everything. Ever been blindsided by someone you gave everything to? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before I get into it, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever stood up for yourself after being burned, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and taking your power back. What happened next might surprise you. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, standard brown cardboard with my name written in Mia's familiar scrawl across the address label. Birthday gift, the return address said in smaller print underneath her name. I was carrying my coffee across the operations room when Sergeant Martinez handed it to me with a grin. Happy birthday, Torres. Looks like someone remembered. I set down my mug and took the box, feeling its weight. About the size of a shoebox, maybe 2 pounds. The tape job was sloppy, typical Mia style, with extra strips wrapped around the corners like she'd been in a hurry. For a moment, I just stood there holding it, thinking about how she'd managed to get my APO address right for once. Your sister? Martinez asked, glancing at the label. Yeah, she's not usually this on top of things. That's when Commander Reeves walked in. He was mid-conversation with Lieutenant Chin about patrol rotations, but his eyes caught the package in my hands and his voice just stopped. Not faded out or trailed off, stopped. Like someone had hit a mute button. The silence stretched long enough that Chin turned to see what had grabbed his attention. I looked down at the box, then back up at Reeves. His expression had shifted into something I'd seen before, usually right before he ordered a perimeter sweep or called in air support. Where did this come from? His voice was level, but there was an edge underneath. I held up the box so he could see the label. My sister. It's my birthday. He didn't move closer to look. Instead, his hand went to the radio clipped to his vest. Not touching the talk button yet, just resting there like he was getting ready. Sir, I said. Reeves looked at Chin, then at Martinez, then back at me. Set it down. Sir, it's just, set it down, Torres. I placed the box on the nearest desk. Reeves stepped back, his radio already in his hand. The morning briefing had been routine 15 minutes ago. Now the whole room felt different, like the air pressure had changed. Martinez, clear the area. Chin, get Edie on the line. Commander, this is from my sister. I kept my voice steady, but something cold was starting to move through my chest. I can vouch for you can't vouch for anything right now. He pressed the radio button. Control, this is Reeves. We have a potential package situation in operations. Initiating lockdown protocol. The response crackled back immediately. Copy, Commander. Lockdown in progress. That's when the siren started. The sound cut through everything, conversation, thought, the normal rhythm of base operations. Within seconds, I could hear boots running in the corridor outside. Vehicle engines starting up. The mechanical clunk of the main gate systems engaging. Martinez was already moving people out of the room, his voice calm but firm. Everyone out. Standard evacuation procedure. Chin had her phone out, speaking to someone in rapid technical language I couldn't quite follow. Something about X-ray capability and chemical sensors. I stood there looking at the box on the desk. Mia's handwriting stared back at me. The return address was her apartment in Phoenix, the one she'd moved to 6 months ago after things went sideways with her boyfriend in Tucson. She'd called me about the move, asked if I could help with the security deposit. I'd sent her $800 without asking too many questions. Torres. Reeves' voice brought me back. I need you to step away from the package. I took 3 steps back, my hands automatically moving to my sides in a position of attention. Through the windows, I could see personnel moving in organized patterns across the compound. The flag that had been hanging loose in the still morning air was now snapping in the rotor wash from a helicopter somewhere overhead. Sir, my sister wouldn't. Your sister lives where? Phoenix. She have any new associates? Anyone new in her life? The question hit differently than I expected. I don't know. We don't talk that often. When's the last time you spoke to her? I had to think. 3 weeks ago. Maybe 4. She needed money for car repairs. Reeves nodded like this confirmed something. How much? 300. You send it? Yes, sir. The ED team arrived then, 2 specialists in heavy gear, moving with the deliberate precision that came from handling things that could kill you. They set up their equipment without conversation, professional and focused. One of them started running a scanner over the package while the other consulted a tablet. I watched them work, feeling disconnected from my own body. This was Mia's gift. The sister who used to sneak me extra cookies when mom wasn't looking. Who taught me how to braid friendship bracelets in middle school. Who cried when I left for basic training because she said she'd miss having someone to watch terrible movies with. But it was also Mia who'd gotten arrested for shoplifting at 17. Mia who dropped out of community college to follow some guy to Vegas. Mia who always seemed to be one step ahead of trouble, or one step behind it, depending on how you looked at things. Initial scan shows no obvious explosive signatures, one of the EOD specialists reported. But there's something electronic inside. Multiple components. Reeves keyed his radio again. Control, extend lockdown perimeter to include family housing. No one in or out until we have full clearance. The base had gone quiet except for the continuing whine of the sirens. Through the window, I could see families being escorted to the community center, children clutching backpacks and looking confused. Mrs. Patterson from the commissary was holding her infant son, talking to one of the MPs with urgent hand gestures. All because of a birthday present from my sister. Torres, Reeves said. I need you to think carefully. Has your sister exhibited any unusual behavior recently? Any new interests, political affiliations, changes in attitude toward the military? I opened my mouth to say no, that Mia had always been supportive of my service, that she sent care packages and told people her sister was a soldier. But then I remembered her last phone call, how she'd sounded different. Distracted. And how she'd asked questions about base security that seemed odd at the time. I'm not sure, sir. The ED specialist looked up from his scanner. Sir, we're going to need to move this to the containment facility. Whatever's inside, it's more complex than a typical improvised device. Reeves nodded. Do it. As they prepared to transport the package, I realized I was still holding my coffee mug. The coffee had gone cold, and there was a small chip in the handle I'd never noticed before. Such a small thing, but suddenly it felt like the only solid, real object in a world that had turned uncertain. The lockdown sirens were still wailing when they carried Mia's gift out of the room. The investigation room smelled like industrial disinfectant and old coffee. I'd been sitting at the metal table for 2 hours, answering the same questions in different configurations. The walls were bare except for a clock that seemed to be moving backward and a security camera that tracked my movements with mechanical precision. Agent Morrison from CID had introduced herself with a firm handshake and a file folder thick enough to stop a bullet. She'd been professional, thorough, and completely unmoved by my insistence that there had to be some mistake. Tell me about your sister's financial situation, she said, pen poised over a legal pad covered in neat handwriting. She struggles. Always has. That's why I send money sometimes. How much money, total, would you estimate you've sent her over the past year? I'd been trying not to think about that number. Maybe $4,000. Morrison wrote this down without reaction. That's a significant amount on an enlisted salary. She's family. Does she have a job currently? She was working at a call center. Customer service for some insurance company. But I think she got laid off last month. You think? She mentioned it when she called about the car repairs. Said work was slow and they were cutting people. Morrison flipped through several pages in the folder. We haven't been able to verify employment at any insurance companies in the Phoenix area. Not in the past 6 months. The information sat between us like a stone dropped in still water. I felt the ripples of it spreading out, touching other things I'd assumed were true. She could have been working somewhere else, I said. Possible. Tell me about her social circle. Friends, romantic relationships, people she spends time with. I don't really know her friends. We don't live in the same state. But when you talk, does she mention people? Names that come up regularly. I thought about our phone conversations, trying to remember details beyond the requests for money and the general updates about her life. She mentioned someone named Derek a few times. I thought he might be a boyfriend, but she never said directly. Derek what? I don't know his last name. Morrison made another note. Anyone else? There was someone called Tank she mentioned once or twice. I assumed it was a nickname. In what context? I tried to remember. Something about going to concerts with him. Or parties. She said he had connections for getting tickets to shows that were sold out. What kind of shows? I don't know. Music, I guess. The questions continued like this, each one revealing how little I actually knew about Mia's daily life. Where she went, who she spent time with, how she was really supporting herself. The sister I thought I was helping started to feel like a stranger I'd been sending money to out of habit. Let's talk about the package itself, Morrison said. When you saw it, did anything strike you as unusual? The tape job was sloppy. But that's normal for Mia. She's not detail-oriented. What about the weight? The size? It felt like maybe a book or a small electronic device. Nothing heavy. Did you shake it? No. Morrison consulted her notes. The package contained a tablet computer, a portable hard drive, and several USB devices. Also a note. She reached into the folder and pulled out a clear evidence bag containing a piece of paper. Mia's handwriting again, but neater than usual, like she'd been trying to be careful. Happy birthday, Maya. Thought you might find this interesting. Thanks for always being there when I needed help. Love, Mia. I stared at the note through the plastic. That's it. That's the extent of the written communication. The electronic devices are being analyzed, but preliminary examination suggests they contain information about base security protocols, shift schedules, and personnel files. The room went very quiet. Outside, I could hear vehicles moving around the compound, the ongoing activity of a facility that was still locked down because of something my sister had sent me. Agent Morrison, I need you to understand something. I had no knowledge of any of this. I would never, I believe you, Sergeant Torres. But I need you to help me understand how your sister obtained this information. I never gave her any classified materials. Directly, no. But think about your conversations with her. Did you ever mention work? Complain about your schedule, talk about people you work with, mention anything about base operations. The question opened up a catalog of memories I didn't want to examine. Phone calls where I'd vented about long shifts. Casual mentions of which units were deploying when. Complaints about new security procedures that were making everything take longer. I might have mentioned general things. The way anyone talks about their job. Can you be more specific? I thought about the call 3 months ago when Mia had asked about my work schedule, saying she wanted to plan a visit. How she'd seemed interested in when I'd be free, which weeks were busiest, whether there were times when security was lighter because of training exercises. At the time, it had felt like normal conversation. Now it felt like reconnaissance. She asked about visiting, I said slowly. Wanted to know about my schedule, when might be a good time. What did you tell her? That spring was usually busy because of training rotations. That summer might be better. Morrison wrote this down. Anything else? I was remembering more now, details that had seemed innocent in context. Questions about where I lived on base, whether I had roommates, how mail was delivered. Her interest in my friends, the people I worked with, their names and what they did. She was curious about military life, I admitted. Asked a lot of questions. What kind of questions? About how things worked. Security procedures, daily routines. I thought she was just trying to understand my world better. Morrison nodded like she'd heard this before. Family members often seem naturally curious about military life. It provides good cover for intelligence gathering. The words hit me like a physical blow. Intelligence gathering. As if my sister was a spy instead of a chronically broke 26-year-old who couldn't hold down a job. Agent Morrison, you're talking about my sister like she's some kind of enemy operative. She's just irresponsible, not a terrorist. Sergeant Torres, irresponsible people make excellent assets for actual operatives. They need money, they're not particularly careful about security, and they have emotional connections that can be leveraged. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were moving inward. You think someone was using her to get to me? I think that's the most likely explanation for what we found in that package. Through the small window in the door, I could see personnel moving in the corridor. Normal base operations continuing while my world rearranged itself around this new understanding of my sister and my own vulnerability. What happens now? I asked. Morrison closed the folder. That depends on what we find when we finish analyzing the devices and what your sister tells us when we interview her. You're going to arrest her. She's already in custody. Phoenix PD picked her up an hour ago. I thought about Mia in a holding cell somewhere, probably scared and confused, maybe calling for me to help her the way she'd always done when things went wrong. Except this time, I was part of the problem instead of the solution. Can I talk to her? No, Morrison said. And Sergeant Torres, I need you to understand something. Until we know the full scope of this situation, your security clearance is suspended and you're restricted to base. You're not under arrest, but you're not free to leave either. The investigation had become my new reality. I was living in a space between trust and suspicion, between being a victim and being complicit. And somewhere in Phoenix, Mia was probably discovering that the consequences for her choices had finally caught up with both of us. Growing up, Mia and I shared a bedroom with walls thin enough that we could hear each other breathe at night. She was 3 years younger, which meant I was automatically responsible for her in that way older siblings understand without being told. When she had nightmares, I'd let her crawl into my bed. When she got in trouble at school, I'd help her figure out what to tell mom and dad. She was the kind of kid who climbed trees that were too tall and jumped off swings at the highest point. I was the one who watched for broken bones and walked her to the nurse's office when the inevitable accidents happened. By the time we were teenagers, the pattern was established. Mia took risks, I managed consequences. The first time she got arrested, she was 17 and I was 20, home on leave from basic training. Shoplifting, like I'd told Agent Morrison, but it was more complicated than that. She'd been with a group of friends who dared each other to steal increasingly expensive items from the mall. What started as candy bars escalated to jewelry, and Mia was the one who got caught with a $100 necklace in her backpack. I sat with her in the juvenile holding area, watching her cry and promising it would never happen again. The charges were eventually dropped in exchange for community service, but I could see something in her face that worried me. Not remorse exactly, but a kind of excitement about having gotten away with most of it. It was like a game, she said on the drive home. See how much you could take before anyone noticed. It's not a game, Mia. People go to prison for theft. But I didn't take that much. And everyone does it. That conversation stayed with me through the rest of my military training. The casual way she dismissed the seriousness of what she'd done, like consequences were something that happened to other people. When I got my first assignment and started sending money home to help with family expenses, part of me was hoping it would keep her out of trouble. It didn't. The calls came regularly after that. Car repairs, rent money, medical bills, court fees for various minor infractions. Each time, Mia would sound genuinely apologetic and promise she was getting her life together. Each time, I'd send what I could afford and sometimes more than I could afford. You're enabling her, my friend Jessica had said during one of our video calls. Jessica was stationed in Germany, dealing with her own family drama involving a brother with gambling problems. She's never going to learn to handle her own problems if you keep bailing her out. She's family, I'd said, the same thing I'd told Agent Morrison. Family doesn't mean you have to bankrupt yourself to fix someone else's mistakes. But that's exactly what it had meant to me. Family was the people you protected, even when they made it difficult. Even when they made choices that put them in danger. I'd grown up believing that loyalty was absolute, that you stood by the people you loved no matter what. The irony wasn't lost on me now, sitting in my restricted quarters on a base that was still partially locked down because of my absolute loyalty to someone who'd been gathering intelligence about my workplace. I'd been thinking about Derek and Tank, the names I'd mentioned to Morrison. Trying to remember other details from conversations with Mia that might have seemed innocent, but weren't. She'd asked about my friends, wanted to know their names and what they did. She'd been curious about my living situation, about base layout, about schedules and procedures. At Christmas, she'd asked me to send pictures of the base. I want to see where my sister works, she'd said. I'm proud of you, and I want to be able to picture you in your daily life. I'd sent her a few photos from the common areas, nothing classified or sensitive. Just shots of the dining facility, the gym, the parking area outside my unit. Normal stuff that families share with each other. Except now I wondered who else had seen those photos. The restricted quarters were comfortable enough. A small apartment with a kitchenette, a desk, and a window that looked out onto the base motor pool. I had books, internet access for personal use, and permission to walk around certain areas of the base for exercise. It was isolation, not imprisonment, but the distinction felt academic. Commander Reeves had visited twice since the lockdown, both times to check on my mental state and to remind me that the investigation was ongoing. He'd been careful not to discuss details, but his manner suggested the situation was more serious than a simple case of a sister making bad choices. How long do these things usually take? I'd asked during his second visit. As long as they take, he'd said. The important thing is that we get it right. On the third day of my restriction, I got a call from my parents. They'd been contacted by Phoenix police and were driving from Albuquerque to see what help they could provide to Mia. My father's voice was tight with stress and confusion. Maya, we don't understand what's happening. The police are saying Mia was involved in something serious, but they won't tell us what. I can't discuss the details, Dad. I'm sorry. But you're okay? You're not in trouble. I looked around my restricted quarters, thought about my suspended security clearance and the investigation that would probably determine the rest of my military career. I'm okay. But this is serious, and it's going to take time to resolve. My mother got on the phone then, her voice breaking. Mia says she doesn't understand what she did wrong. She says she was just trying to send you a nice birthday present. The present. The tablet, hard drive, and USB devices filled with information about base security. Information that someone had compiled and given to my sister to send to me, probably knowing that it would cause exactly the kind of disruption it had caused. Mom, I need you and Dad to be very careful about what you say to Mia and what you say to anyone else. This is a federal investigation now. Federal. My father was back on the line. Maya, what kind of trouble is she in? I couldn't tell them about the intelligence gathering, about the suspicion that Mia had been used as an asset by people who wanted access to military information. I couldn't explain that their youngest daughter was either a willing participant in espionage or a useful idiot who'd been manipulated into compromising national security. She's in serious trouble, Dad. The kind that doesn't get fixed with community service or paying fines. After they hung up, I sat in the quiet of my restricted quarters thinking about family loyalty and where it led when it wasn't balanced by judgment. I'd spent years protecting Mia from consequences, sending money to solve problems, believing that my role was to be her safety net no matter what choices she made. But somewhere along the way, that safety net had become a vulnerability that put other people at risk. My loyalty to her had been used against my loyalty to the military, to my fellow soldiers, to the mission we were all committed to protecting. The base had returned to normal operations, but I was still suspended between worlds, not quite trusted, not quite blamed, waiting for an investigation to determine which side of the line I'd end up on. Commander Reeves found me in the restricted quarters 4 days after the lockdown, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept much. He'd aged in the past week, new lines around his eyes and a tightness in his posture that suggested the investigation was taking its toll on everyone. We need to talk, he said, settling into the chair across from my small kitchen table. I'd been expecting this conversation, the one where he'd tell me whether my military career was over. The coffee was good, real coffee, not the industrial stuff from the dining facility, which seemed like either a good sign or a last gesture of respect before bad news. The electronic devices your sister sent contained detailed information about base security protocols, personnel schedules, and classified operational procedures, Reeves said without preamble. Information that could only have been compiled by someone with extensive access to our systems. Sir, I never provided any classified information to my sister or anyone else. I know. The investigation has confirmed that. He paused to sip his coffee. But the information had to come from somewhere, and the level of detail suggests it came from multiple sources over an extended period of time. I thought about the phone calls, the casual conversations about work, the photos I'd sent at Christmas. I talked about general things with her. The way anyone talks about their job. I understand. And under normal circumstances, that kind of communication with family members isn't problematic. But your sister was sharing information with people who knew how to use it. Derek and Tank? Among others. We're still mapping the network, but it appears your sister was connected to a group that specializes in gathering intelligence from military personnel through their family relationships. The words settled over me like a weight. Mia hadn't just made bad choices or gotten in over her head with the wrong people. She'd been part of something organized, something deliberate. Was she working for them willingly? Reeves considered this. That's complicated. She was receiving money for information, but she may not have understood the full scope of what she was involved in. People like your sister, young, financially struggling, not particularly sophisticated about security, make ideal assets because they can gather information without fully understanding what they're doing. So she's both a victim and a perpetrator. Something like that. I thought about all the money I'd sent her over the years, all the times I'd helped her out of financial trouble. If she'd been receiving payment for intelligence gathering, she hadn't needed my help as much as I'd thought. Or maybe she'd needed it more, if she'd gotten involved in intelligence work because she was desperate for money. What happens to her now? That depends on her level of cooperation with federal investigators and what they determine about her intent. She could face charges ranging from mishandling classified information to espionage. And what happens to me? Reeves set down his coffee cup and looked at me directly. Torres, I've been in command positions for 15 years, and I've seen good soldiers get caught up in situations like this. Usually, it ends their careers, even when they haven't done anything intentionally wrong. My heart sank. I'd been preparing for this possibility, but hearing it stated plainly still hit like a punch to the chest. However, he continued, your record is clean, your cooperation with the investigation has been complete, and the consensus is that you were manipulated, not complicit. We can't afford loose ends, not here. But we also can't afford to lose good people because their family members made bad choices. Sir, your security clearance will be reinstated, but you'll be subject to enhanced monitoring and periodic reevaluation. You'll also be required to participate in additional security training and to report any contact from family members who might be involved in this network. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. I can stay. You can stay. But Torres, this is your one chance. Any future security issues involving your family relationships will end your military career immediately. I understand, sir. Do you? Because what I'm telling you is that your loyalty to your sister nearly cost you everything, and it put this entire base at risk. That can't happen again. I thought about Mia in federal custody, probably confused and scared, maybe angry that I wasn't rushing to help her this time. The sister who'd shared my bedroom and my secrets, who'd depended on me to protect her from consequences, who'd used that protection to put me and everyone around me in danger. It won't happen again, I said. We've blocked all communication between you and your sister while the investigation is ongoing. That includes phone calls, letters, email, and third-party messages through your parents or other family members. How long? Until the case is resolved. Months, probably. Maybe longer. The isolation felt complete now. Not just physical restriction to base, but emotional restriction from the person who'd been central to my understanding of family loyalty. Sir, can I ask you something? Go ahead. How do you balance loyalty to family with loyalty to mission? When they conflict? Reeves was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the motor pool where soldiers were conducting routine maintenance on vehicles. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You know what I learned after 22 years of military service? Loyalty without boundaries isn't loyalty at all. It's enabling. Real loyalty means holding people accountable when they make choices that hurt themselves and others. Even family? Especially family. Because they're the ones who can do the most damage to you and the people you're responsible for protecting. He stood up, collecting the empty coffee cups. Torres, you're a good soldier and a good person. But you've been loyal to your sister's potential instead of to her actions. That's something you'll need to think about going forward. After he left, I sat in my small kitchen thinking about loyalty and boundaries, about the difference between protecting someone and enabling them. For the first time since the lockdown, I felt like I had solid ground under my feet, even though the ground looked different than it had before. The investigation had changed me in ways I was still discovering. Not just my relationship with Mia, but my understanding of what it meant to be responsible for other people's safety. The soldiers I worked with, the mission we were committed to, the trust that made everything possible, all of that had been at risk because I'd never learned to say no to someone I loved. It was the hardest lesson I'd ever learned, but maybe it was the one I'd needed most. 2 months after the lockdown, I was back to full duties with a security clearance that came with extra oversight and regular check-ins with intelligence officers. The routine was familiar but different, like returning to a house where the furniture had been rearranged while I was away. I knew where everything was, but the muscle memory was slightly off. The enhanced monitoring felt intrusive at first. Additional paperwork for personal relationships, mandatory reporting of family contact attempts, periodic interviews about my social activities. But gradually it became just another part of military life, like PT tests and safety briefings. The price of staying in the career I'd worked hard to build. My fellow soldiers had been professional throughout the whole ordeal. No one asked direct questions about what had happened, but there were subtle indicators that the story had circulated through the base. Extra friendliness from some people, careful distance from others, conversations that paused when I entered rooms. I'd become a cautionary tale about operational security, which was probably fair. The work helped. Routine operations, training exercises, the familiar rhythm of military life. I threw myself into duties with the intensity of someone grateful to have duties to throw herself into. My performance evaluations were strong, my relationships with colleagues gradually normalized, and slowly I started to feel like I belonged again instead of being on probation. But Mia's absence was a constant presence in my daily life. No more random phone calls asking for money or updates about her chaotic existence. No more birthday cards with sloppy handwriting or holiday packages filled with random items she thought I might need. The silence was what I'd asked for, but it felt heavier than I'd expected. My parents called occasionally, careful conversations about family news that avoided any mention of Mia's situation. They'd been told by federal investigators not to discuss the case with me, which created an awkward dynamic where we all knew we couldn't talk about the most important thing happening to our family. "Your Aunt Ruth is getting married again," my mother said during one call, her voice artificially bright. "Third time's the charm, I suppose." "That's nice, Mom." She asked if you'd be able to get leave to attend the wedding. "It's in October. I'll check my schedule." These conversations felt like elaborate dances around the empty space where Mia used to be. We all knew she was there in our thoughts, but mentioning her name had become forbidden, which made every other topic feel forced and incomplete. The investigation had concluded with mixed results. Mia had been convicted on federal charges related to mishandling classified information, but the espionage charges had been dropped in exchange for her cooperation with ongoing investigations into the network she'd been connected to. She'd received a suspended sentence with probation, which meant she wouldn't go to prison as long as she stayed out of trouble. I learned these details through official channels, not family communication. Agent Morrison had briefed me on the resolution as part of closing my case, her tone professional and neutral. "Your sister provided substantial assistance in identifying other members of the network," Morrison had explained. "Without her cooperation, we wouldn't have been able to map the full scope of their operations." "Is she okay?" "She's adjusting to civilian life with significant restrictions on her activities and associations. The probation terms are extensive." That was all I was told, and all I was allowed to know. Mia had become a classified subject in my own life, someone I could think about but not contact, worry about but not help. The hardest part was learning to redirect the protective instincts I'd developed over 23 years of being her older sister. When I had problems to solve or extra money in my paycheck, my first thought was still to check if Mia needed anything. When I heard songs she would have liked or saw movies she would have wanted to discuss, I automatically reached for my phone before remembering I couldn't call her. Breaking the pattern of caretaking was like breaking any other addiction. It required constant conscious choice and the development of new habits to replace the old ones. I started sending care packages to deployed soldiers instead of money to Mia. I volunteered for base family events instead of listening to her relationship problems. I redirected the energy I'd spent managing her crises into activities that actually helped people. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, like physical therapy after an injury, daily exercises that slowly restored strength and function. Some days were harder than others, especially when I got news about family events she wasn't attending or holidays that felt incomplete without her chaotic presence. But gradually, I started to understand what Commander Reeves had meant about loyalty with boundaries. Real protection sometimes meant letting people face consequences for their choices. Real love sometimes required saying no to requests that would enable destructive behavior. I was learning to distinguish between helping and fixing, between support and enabling, between loyalty and codependency. These distinctions had seemed academic before the investigation, but now they were practical skills I needed for survival, mine and the people I was responsible for protecting. The base felt different too, not just because of my changed status, but because of my changed understanding of security. I noticed things I'd overlooked before: casual conversations in public spaces, information shared without thinking, the small vulnerabilities that could become large problems if exploited by people who knew what to look for. I'd become more careful about my own operational security, more aware of how seemingly innocent information could be pieced together into something dangerous. It was a loss of innocence that made me better at my job, but also more isolated from the easy camaraderie I'd enjoyed before understanding how much was at stake. 6 months after the lockdown, I was promoted to staff sergeant. The ceremony was routine, but for me it felt like a milestone marking my full return to trusted status. Commander Reeves shook my hand afterward and said simply, "Well earned, Torres." The promotion came with new responsibilities and the opportunity to mentor junior soldiers, some of whom were dealing with their own family complications. I found myself sharing lessons I'd learned about boundaries and security, about the difference between protecting people and enabling them to make destructive choices. It was strange to realize that Mia's betrayal had made me a better soldier and a better leader. The crisis that had nearly ended my career had also taught me skills I wouldn't have developed any other way. I was more thoughtful about trust, more deliberate about loyalty, more skilled at helping people without taking responsibility for their choices. But I still missed my sister, even as I understood why she had to stay out of my life. 8 months after the lockdown, I was sorting through mail in my apartment when I found an envelope with no return address, but handwriting I recognized immediately. My heart started beating faster as I opened it, breaking protocols I'd agreed to follow and risking consequences I'd promised to avoid. The letter was short, written on plain paper in Mia's careful script, the same neat handwriting she'd used for the birthday note that had started everything. "Maya, I know I'm not supposed to contact you, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did and why you can't help me anymore. I was stupid and selfish, and I put you in danger because I was too scared to figure out my own problems. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm getting help and trying to build a life that doesn't hurt the people I love. I hope someday we can talk again, but I understand if that never happens. I'm proud of you for choosing your duty over me. It was the right thing to do, even though it hurt. Love, Mia." I read the letter 3 times, feeling emotions I'd been suppressing for months. Relief that she was okay, anger that she'd broken the no-contact rules, sadness about the distance between us, pride that she was taking responsibility for her choices. But mostly I felt clarity about what I needed to do. I walked to the base security office and handed the letter to the duty officer, explaining that I'd received unauthorized contact from a family member involved in the previous security incident. The officer took the letter without comment and said someone would follow up with me about additional security measures. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, turning in a letter from my sister, knowing it would probably extend her probation and eliminate any possibility of early contact restoration. But it was also the clearest expression of the boundary I'd learned to maintain between personal loyalty and professional responsibility. That evening, Commander Reeves called me to his office. The letter was on his desk in a clear evidence bag, already processed and cataloged. "This couldn't have been easy," he said. "No, sir. But it was necessary. Your sister took a significant risk sending this. She had to know it would have consequences for both of you." I thought about that. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she needed to know that I'd really changed, that I'd choose duty over family loyalty when they conflicted. And now she knows. Now we both know. Reeves nodded. Torres, I want you to understand something. What you did today, reporting this contact immediately instead of hiding it or trying to handle it yourself, that's what rebuilds trust. Not just with your command, but with yourself. Sir, you've spent the better part of a year learning to be loyal to principles instead of just people. Today you proved you understand the difference. Walking back to my quarters, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the investigation, peace with my choices. Not happiness exactly, but the solid satisfaction that comes from acting according to values you've tested under pressure. The letter had been Mia's way of saying goodbye to our old relationship and acknowledging the new boundaries that would define any future contact. She'd taken responsibility for her choices and accepted the consequences of mine. In its own way, it was the most mature communication we'd ever had. I knew there would be additional security reviews, more restrictions, probably a longer waiting period before any family contact would be allowed. But I also knew I could handle whatever came next, because I'd finally learned to balance competing loyalties without compromising either. The base went quiet as evening shift change approached. I could see soldiers ending their duty day, heading to the dining facility or the gym or their quarters to call home. Normal routines for people who'd earned the right to normal routines through their commitment to something larger than individual relationships. I'd earned that right back through the hardest lesson of my life. Sometimes protecting the people you love means protecting them from yourself, and sometimes protecting yourself means setting boundaries with the people you love most. The lockdown had ended months ago, but in many ways, I was just now free. Looking back now, 18 months later, I can see the investigation clearly for what it was, not just a security incident, but the moment I learned the difference between loyalty and enablement, between protecting people and protecting principles. Mia and I exchange letters now, carefully monitored communications that happen quarterly with official approval. The relationship is formal and distant, nothing like the easy intimacy we'd shared growing up, but it's honest in a way our previous relationship never was. She writes about her job at a nonprofit organization, her court-mandated therapy sessions, her slow process of learning to make decisions without expecting someone else to handle the consequences. I write about my work, my promotions, my life on base. We don't discuss the investigation or the network she'd been involved with. We don't make plans to visit or talk about rebuilding trust. We acknowledge each other's existence and growth without pretending the damage can be undone. It's not the sisterhood either of us grew up expecting, but it's the relationship we've earned through our choices. The security protocols I follow now feel routine rather than restrictive. Enhanced monitoring, regular interviews, detailed reporting requirements for personal relationships, all of it has become integrated into my professional life. My clearance level was fully restored after a year of probationary status, and my performance evaluations consistently note strong judgment and reliability. More importantly, I've learned to apply the same security thinking to personal relationships that I apply to professional ones. I assess people's motivations. I verify information instead of accepting it automatically. I maintain appropriate boundaries even with people I care about. It's made me more cautious in some ways, but also more genuine in my connections with people who've proven themselves trustworthy. The other soldiers in my unit know my story in general terms. Everyone understands that I went through a security investigation related to family issues and came out the other side with enhanced protocols. It's not uncommon in military careers, and it's created opportunities for me to mentor junior personnel who are dealing with similar challenges. Last month, I counseled a young private whose brother was asking suspicious questions about base operations. The private was torn between family loyalty and duty obligations, the same conflict I'd struggled with. I was able to help her understand that real protection sometimes means saying no to people you love, that boundaries aren't betrayal but responsibility. It feels like I'm choosing the military over my family, she'd said. You're not choosing the military over your family. You're choosing principles over convenience. There's a difference. She reported her brother's inquiries to security and avoided what could have been a career-ending compromise. Watching her make that choice with confidence rather than anguish showed me how much I'd learned about the integration of personal values and professional obligations. My parents and I have rebuilt our relationship around the new normal. We talk monthly, share news about extended family, discuss my career progression and their retirement plans. Mia's situation is acknowledged but not dwelt on. She's doing well in her restricted life. They're proud of how I've handled everything, and we all understand that some changes are permanent. You seem different, my mother said during their last visit to the base. More settled, somehow. She was right. The investigation had forced me to examine assumptions I'd never questioned, to develop skills I'd never needed, to make choices I'd never imagined having to make. The process had been painful, but the result was a clearer understanding of my own values and capabilities. I'd learned that loyalty without judgment isn't loyalty at all. It's just habit disguised as virtue. Real loyalty requires the courage to hold people accountable for their choices, even when those people are family, even when accountability is uncomfortable. I'd also learned that betrayal isn't always intentional or malicious. Sometimes people we trust make choices that put us at risk simply because they don't understand the consequences of their actions or because they're being manipulated by people who do understand. The betrayal is real regardless of intent, but understanding the context helps with forgiveness and moving forward. The base feels like home in a way it hadn't before the investigation. Not because the physical environment changed, but because my understanding of what I was protecting and why I was protecting it had deepened. The mission wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal in the best sense, grounded in clear knowledge of what happened when security failed. I'd been promoted twice since the investigation, given additional responsibilities, selected for leadership training programs. My career had not only survived the crisis, but had been strengthened by it. The skills I'd developed managing family drama had translated into better management of military operations. The emotional intelligence I'd gained from learning about manipulation and enablement made me more effective at building team cohesion and identifying potential problems before they became critical. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd never reported the unauthorized letter from Mia, if I'd tried to handle the family situation privately instead of involving command. Would I have been able to maintain both relationships without compromising either? Would the investigation have concluded differently if I'd shown divided loyalty? But those questions felt academic now. I'd made my choices based on principles I'd learned to value more than convenience or emotional comfort. The consequences had been exactly what they needed to be: clear, proportionate, and educational for everyone involved. The package that had arrived on my birthday had been wrapped in more than just sloppy tape and brown paper. It had been wrapped in assumptions about loyalty, family, and trust that had taken months to unwrap and examine. What I'd found underneath wasn't what I'd expected, but it was what I'd needed. A clear understanding of the difference between protecting people and enabling them, between loyalty and codependency, between love and responsibility. Mia's gift had been a test I hadn't known I was taking, and passing it had required letting go of the relationship I'd thought I wanted in order to build the life I actually needed. The lockdown had lasted only a few hours, but the lessons had taken much longer to understand and integrate. Now, when I see soldiers struggling with family complications or security concerns, I understand that the real battle isn't between personal loyalty and professional duty. The real battle is between the person you've been and the person you need to become, between the relationships that feel comfortable and the relationships that actually serve everyone's best interests. It's a battle worth fighting, and it's one you can win, but only if you're willing to acknowledge that some victories require letting go of what you thought you wanted most. The investigation was over. The lockdown had ended. But the transformation it had started would continue for the rest of my military career and beyond. A permanent reminder that the most important security protocols are the ones you maintain in your own heart. 2 years after the lockdown, I received orders for deployment to Afghanistan. The assignment came with a security briefing that referenced my previous investigation, not as a liability, but as an asset. My experience with intelligence gathering and family manipulation had given me insights that would be valuable in a theater where those tactics were common. You understand how these networks operate, Colonel Martinez explained during my pre-deployment briefing. How they identify vulnerabilities, how they exploit personal relationships, how they use emotional manipulation to gather information. That knowledge makes you more effective at protecting your soldiers from similar tactics. The deployment was my first extended overseas assignment since the investigation, and it felt like a final test of the lessons I'd learned. In Afghanistan, the stakes were higher, the security environment more complex, and the temptations to blur professional boundaries more frequent. Local interpreters with family members in need, contractors offering personal favors in exchange for information, coalition partners with questionable security practices. Every interaction required the kind of careful evaluation I'd learned to apply in my personal life. I found myself naturally taking point on security briefings for new arrivals, sharing practical lessons about operational security that went beyond the standard presentations. I talked about how intelligence gathering worked through personal relationships, how to recognize when someone was asking the wrong kinds of questions, how to maintain professional boundaries without becoming paranoid or isolated. The goal isn't to trust no one, I told a group of young soldiers during orientation. The goal is to trust appropriately, based on verification rather than assumption, based on patterns of behavior rather than good intentions. The deployment also gave me perspective on my relationship with Mia. The distance and communication restrictions of a combat environment made the supervised quarterly letters seem almost luxurious. I wrote to her about the landscape, the mission, the sense of purpose that came from knowing exactly what I was protecting and why. She wrote back about her work with veteran services, her night classes in accounting, her small apartment in a city I'd never seen. The letters were brief and careful, but they contained something that had been missing from our previous relationship: mutual respect. She respected my boundaries and responsibilities. I respected her efforts to build a life within the constraints she'd accepted. We weren't trying to return to our old dynamic or pretend the damage hadn't happened. We were building something new on the foundation of hard-earned honesty. Midway through the deployment, I was selected for the Non-Commissioned Officer Leadership course, a program that would prepare me for senior enlisted positions. The selection was competitive, and my commander's recommendation letter specifically mentioned my ability to balance competing loyalties and maintain security consciousness under pressure. Staff Sergeant Torres has demonstrated exceptional judgment in complex situations involving personal and professional obligations, the letter stated. Her experience with security investigations has enhanced rather than compromised her effectiveness as a leader and mentor. The course itself was challenging, combining tactical leadership with strategic thinking and ethical decision-making. One of the case studies we analyzed involved a scenario remarkably similar to my own experience: a soldier whose family member had been compromised by foreign intelligence services. The other students in the class discussed the theoretical challenges of divided loyalty and security protocols, while I provided practical insights from having lived through the situation. The hardest part isn't making the right choice, I said during one seminar discussion. The hardest part is accepting that the right choice might mean losing relationships you've defined yourself by. The instructor, a senior master sergeant with 25 years of experience, nodded approvingly. And what did you learn about maintaining those relationships after making the hard choices? I thought about Mia's quarterly letters, about my parents' careful phone calls, about the new boundaries that had redefined but not eliminated family connections. I learned that real relationships can survive hard choices, but they might look different afterward. And that sometimes different is better, even when it's more difficult. After completing the leadership course, I was promoted to Sergeant First Class and given responsibility for a training program focused on operational security and counterintelligence awareness. The program was designed around real-world scenarios and practical decision-making rather than abstract policy discussion. I drew heavily on my own experience, creating training modules that helped soldiers recognize and respond to intelligence-gathering attempts through personal relationships. The program was successful enough that I was invited to present it at other bases and to contribute to military publications on security awareness. My article, Family Loyalty and Operational Security: Lessons from the Field, was published in the Army's Professional Development Journal and generated discussion throughout the intelligence community. Writing about the experience publicly, even in sanitized professional terms, was another kind of closure. I was able to articulate lessons learned without revealing operational details, to share insights that might help other soldiers avoid similar compromises, to transform personal pain into professional contribution. The responses to the article were uniformly positive, but the one that meant most came from Agent Morrison, who sent a brief note through official channels. Your article accurately captured the complexity of these situations and provided valuable guidance for security personnel. Thank you for turning a difficult experience into a teaching opportunity. As my deployment neared its end, I began planning for my next assignment and considering longer-term career goals. The security investigation that had once threatened to end my military service had instead become a foundation for advancement. I was being considered for positions in counterintelligence, for advanced leadership roles, for assignments that specifically required the kind of judgment and experience I developed through crisis. You've turned your biggest vulnerability into your greatest strength, my deployment commander said during my final evaluation. That's not something everyone can do. The observations stayed with me during the long flight home. I'd spent years seeing the investigation as something that had happened to me, a crisis I'd survived and lessons I'd learned. But gradually I'd come to understand it as something that had happened for me, a transformation that had made me better at my job, better at relationships, better at understanding the balance between competing obligations. Landing at the airport in Baltimore, I felt the satisfaction of completing a successful deployment enhanced by the knowledge that I'd proven myself capable of maintaining security consciousness under the most challenging conditions. The investigation had tested my judgment in a laboratory setting. Afghanistan had tested it in the field. Both tests had been passed. My parents met me at the airport, older and grayer than when I'd left, but proud in a way that felt different from their pride in my initial military success. This was pride earned through adversity, through watching me make hard choices and live with their consequences, through seeing me grow into someone who could balance love and duty without compromising either. "Welcome home," my father said, embracing me in the baggage claim area. "We missed you." "I missed you too," I said, and meant it. But I also knew that the person they'd missed wasn't quite the same person who'd returned. The deployment had completed a transformation that had begun with Mia's package, turning me into someone who could carry responsibility without being crushed by it, who could maintain loyalty without being consumed by it. The base that awaited me was the same one I'd left 18 months earlier, but I was returning with new rank, new responsibilities, and most importantly, new understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than personal relationships or individual comfort. The investigation had taught me about boundaries. The deployment had taught me about purpose. Together, they'd prepared me for whatever challenges lay ahead. As I walked through the familiar gates, past the security checkpoints that had once seemed routine but now represented layers of protection I understood intimately, I realized that the lockdown had never really ended. It had simply evolved into a permanent state of enhanced awareness, a continuous choice to prioritize mission over convenience, principles over comfort, collective security over individual desires. It was a choice I was proud to make, every day, for the rest of my career. And that was the moment I learned the difference between protecting family and enabling them. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right one. What about you? Have you ever had to draw a hard line with someone close to you? Did it cost you the relationship or make it stronger? Let me know your story in the comments. If this resonated, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that boundaries are strength, not betrayal.